Hello everybody, this is Manu S, and welcome to another Eternal Top Decks video. I'm finally back and got my latest video series for you, and we finally gonna talk about some Praxis here. Been a long time since I actually talked about Praxis. Last time was before Omens of the Past, and for most of the time it either didn't like the archetype much or simply couldn't find a list that I liked enough and was confident enough in every card choice to basically record it, and also didn't have enough games with the archetype to feel confident enough in providing you guys with a list that I would recommend and having enough insight on how to build and play and approach the deck basically. But now I feel like I do, so time to share it with you. Deck is basically a super archetypical mid-range deck in the sense that it peaks in the very mid-game around like its 6-7 drop kind of turns, and usually creates one or multiple choke turns in the mid-game where it is usually way ahead of what the opponent is doing, no matter if they are a faster or a slower deck. And those are the critical turns where the deck either wins or doesn't, and usually decides the fate of the deck, and the outcome of a given game is decided from what I felt. And yeah, let's talk about the card choices. In terms of units, we have 4 Initiative of the Sands, 2 Friendly Wisp, 4 Temple Scribe, 4 Amber Acolyte, 4 Dawnwalker, 1 Diogo Málaga, 3 Praxis Displacer, 4 Sandstorm Titan, 2 Shatterglass Mage, 4 Heart of the Vault, 2 Predatory Carnosaur, and to a certain extent Amber Monument. So let's discuss those units. Basically, Initiative of the Sands is a bit unintuitive, I would say, in a deck like this, especially without Obelisk, but the fact that we have Warp makes Initiative a lot better, because, you know, having one more power a turn earlier makes it that much more likely to be able to play your Warp cards when you have them on top of your deck, because you have an entire turn more that you could play them if they are on top of your deck, if that makes sense. And the other thing is, the deck actually has a pretty gimpy early game for like the first 2 or 3 turns, so skipping one of those turns with an Initiative of the Sands is extremely beneficial and just better, I think, usually, especially in conjunction with the Warp interaction, than playing one of the some of the bad early game alternatives, early game options basically, especially the 1 and 2 drop options. So Initiate just allows you to rush through that phase of the game where the deck is weakest, and it has played out pretty well. I've been very happy with it, and I think it's the right choice. Then we have 2 Wisp and 4 Temple Scribe, because you gotta do something early on, especially if you don't have an Initiate to skip your turn 2, and Scribe just kind of allows you to play something early against decks where you need some interaction, because most aggro decks run a plethora of units that Temple Scribe can trade with, making it good enough against the decks you need early action, and not harming you much against slower, grindier decks where the unit is too low impact, but since it replaces itself, that's not a problem. And Wisp is basically just kind of a nice way to be a bit more grindy, while also at worst it can be like trading with an early drop against an aggro deck, even though it usually won't generate card advantage, because you can't activate the draw 2 most of the time before you have to trade. But it's just something that is okay early against very aggressive decks, because it can trade, and against slow decks it's a cheap draw 2 on a small evasive body. But yeah, it's kind of situational and can be kind of bad, which is why there's only 2, and the deck also doesn't have that many ways of triggering it, especially on turn 3, like say Elysian-based decks, with False Prince making Wisp a lot less powerful, because there's a longer time for your opponent to silence it, kill it with like a favor or something, or forcing you to trade it off before you get to draw the cards than in Elysian, for example. Amber Acolyte is just very important for the deck to saturate its heavy color requirements for Heart of the Vault, because having a triple fire, triple time card in your deck is, for people that aren't aware of it, still a lot worse than having a card that costs triple fire and a card that costs triple time, because then you can still have triple fire and the triple fire card, but not triple time. Well, here if you don't have triple time or triple fire, either way you're not gonna play your Heart of the Vault, while with the cards, if you have 2 individual cards that require each, there's a lot less mismatch scenarios than with Heart of the Vault, where you have an uncastable card in your hand, even though the requirements for the deck as a whole are still triple fire, triple time. And it's also necessary for having enough power drops with the 6 6/6 drops, and also helps you a bit to make your monuments be usable as units more often, because you might have enough power already, and then you don't have to use your monument as a power source, which is also nice. And also, once again, I already mentioned the early game is kind of bad for this game, for this deck, so having something that helps you in other areas while also providing at least something on the board that it either can chip away a bit at your slow opponent or trade with a mediocre aggressive unit to keep you afloat is very valuable to like keep you afloat while your major game, your mid game plan and power kicks in. Then we have Dawnwalker. Not much to say here. This is like the best early game unit the deck has at the end of the early game. It's also a very important grinding tool, the card that makes the deck much better at beating harsh roll decks and grindy decks in general, while also being like reasonably obnoxious against aggressive decks, both at stalling them out, because having to attack and trade with this every turn and then having it come back, so basically every other turn this eating an additional unit, can wear down an aggro deck heavily, or simply creating scenarios where you can start turning on them with your Dawnwalkers and stuff and raise them before they finish you off, and so on. The one Diogo is kind of an oddball. I personally wouldn't have come up with running one of these guys, and like I really don't like the guy normally, but I can see why you would want to run it in this deck as a one-off, and I quite like the idea and the concept, because the deck, as I said, is like a true mid-range deck in the sense that it has a couple of choke turns or like a bottleneck around the mid-game to late mid-game, and in the early game and in the true late game, the deck is pretty outmatched usually, and Diogo Ultimate is one of those ways that gives you a chance to win in the actual late game, even though you normally aren't supposed to and wouldn't be able to, while not being a pure late game card, because the 3/5 is a pretty solid blocking body against aggressive decks, and a 3 power charge unit with high enough health to not trade with random small units is also an okay threat against control, and especially against like slower decks like control. The ultimate also matters while it doesn't against aggro, but a 3/5 actually makes a pretty good blocker against aggressive decks still. So it still has some impact and some applications in all scenarios, while mainly being in the deck to steal the late game occasionally. And since you basically never want to see 2, because once you ultimate it once, the second is bad. Sure, you could argue that the first one can be silenced or killed before it ultimates and so on, but first of all, you don't have to expose it in slower matchups if you don't want to. And second of all, it's not like you absolutely need or want the ultimate. You just want to have the option. So having one is always nice. Having two is usually bad, so I rather only run one than two, at least in the main deck of a deck, be it ladder or tournament. But yeah, having access to this one copy can randomly steal games, which is nice. The 3 Displacers are actually quite interesting. I was very skeptical about these in the beginning, but they turned out pretty great, because given the like bad and weak early game of the deck, you would think like a tempo-y card like Displacer is kind of a mismatch, because you don't have these like false prints, like initiate into false prints into Displacer kind of turns and stuff, to basically have a dedicated tempo plan. But like I said, the deck has these like choke turn or turns when it's at its peak, and then the tempo from a Displacer can make or break your opponent pretty easily, while also when you're behind against aggressive decks, given the deck has so much more value and power than faster, more aggressive decks, just buying some time, bouncing like their most expensive or best attacker, and trading with one of their medium units at the same time can be enough for you to take over with your more powerful cards. And against super slow and grindy matchups that interact a lot with you, the card actually just becomes a value card. You can rebuy your summon effects and generate value that way. You have friendly Wisps, Temple Scribes, even Amber Acolytes sometimes, and all these 5 and 6 drops that you can rebuy to reuse their summon effects to virtually give your Displacer the summon effect of pay cost of unit X, trigger their summon ability again, which with so many good summon abilities is pretty decent if time and power cost is not a major factor in your game. So it basically has very relevant uses in all styles of games this deck plays and all kinds of scenarios. And sometimes it's a value card, sometimes it's a tempo card, and sometimes it's just like a defensive tool to keep you afloat and reduce tempo from your opponent rather than generate active tempo for you in a way, if that makes sense. And then we have Titan, not much explanation needed here. The heart of every time midrange deck. Overcosted, powerful defensive unit that if it sticks, the game usually heavily swings in your favor against most matchups. Then we have the 2 Shatterglass Mage, just a really nice value guy. It's often a 2-for-1 either by being warped or killing an attachment. Sometimes it's a brutal 3-for-1 by doing both of these things, and sometimes it's just a mediocre draft common as a 5 power 5/3 overwhelm, but as you already noticed, there's a lot more possible scenarios for 2-for-1s and 3-for-1s that those easily outweigh the rarer scenarios where it actually only is a draft common, basically. Also because it, in addition to generating value, it sometimes also generates quite a lot of tempo by killing, say, a 4-cost relic, or at least like a 1-cost attachment like a permafrost. Then we have the heart of the deck, pun intended in a way, since this is what makes the deck function. This is one of the cards that creates these choke turns that I talked about, because the card generates a huge tempo and value swing that usually, at least for a few critical turns, pulls you significantly ahead of your opponent, and the deck is pretty well built to take advantage of this choke advantage, and you can often just use that to overwhelm your opponent in that window that Heart usually creates for you, and that's how I feel like the deck wins a lot of the time. And yeah, that's why I also think you definitely want 4. There were lists that only ran like 3 that have been played in tournaments for quite a bunch. But yeah, even though the card is quite taxing on your power base, it's just so powerful and swingy in most of your matchups, even against aggro, that you want it. Because even against aggro, if you drop this, this is usually where the game ends, because killing one of their attackers, being able to block any of their attackers, usually no matter which size, and eating their best attacker each turn, while also drawing into a free or cheap extra card to generate even more tempo, usually is just enough to pull ahead of them and stop them in their tracks. And then we have 2 Carnosaurs, just basically additional built-in removal, as we already probably know, is that Praxis is not that good at removaling. This is another nice card that provides the deck with some answer potential, some tempo potential, and value potential, so it's in a way similar to what Displacer does for the deck, because it works in different ways in different scenarios, or does multiple of the mentioned things at the same time, and just rounds out the top end of the deck, basically giving you enough value and a power punch in these choke turns that I mentioned to turn a momentary advantage into a win before the opponent either finishes you off with their aggro plan, or the control deck takes over with its true late game plan that overpowers you, basically. Then we have all the spells: 4 Torch, 1 Flame Blast, and 4 Obliterate as burn spells. Torch doesn't really need an explanation. It's super versatile, super efficient, helps the deck's wonky and fragile slow early game, answers a bunch of annoying units, buys you time, finishes off some relic weapons, or simply finishes off opponents that you got almost dead but they are about to take control of the game. It's just never terrible. It's not always great, but it always does something and is potentially game breaking. The 1 Flame Blast is kind of interesting since the nerf, but I think the nerf actually matters the least here, both because it's a one-off that is mostly meant for the late game without being purely for the late game, like not being dead in your hand in the early to mid game, unlike a true late game card. Definitely matters, especially for a mid-range deck. Second of all, the way it got changed means that if you draw it with a Heart of the Vault, it's actually better than before. So there's sometimes scenarios where the nerf becomes a buff. Sure, it's still less scenarios than where the nerf is a nerf, but it just mitigates the nerf a bit. And it's kind of the same thing as Diogo. It's something that does something decent and meaningful in a lot of scenarios and provides the deck with a way to steal the game in the late game when you're running thin and kind of are out of your depths in terms of where your deck is positioned, but you're still not drawing entirely dead. You just might have that Flame Blast in your deck or on top of your deck and can win some games you otherwise couldn't, while still doing some work for you in other scenarios as well. And it just feels like it rounds out the deck nicely. Obliterate is just basically the removal slash finisher. The fact it's not a good removal, especially not these days. The card is becoming worse and worse, both at killing the things you have to kill and becoming more and more noticeable how clunky and inefficient it is in terms of its rate. But the fact that it's a burn spell is pretty relevant in this deck, because once again, this whole like choke turn or choke turns concept that I talked about a bunch already plays towards Obliterate as well, because when you get this temporary tempo swing, tempo advantage, and value advantage, an Obliterate can be enough to push your opponent over the edge, either by shooting down that small jump blocker that would buy them the time to get through those choke turns alive, while also punching them in the face for a bunch, or simply just drawing it off the top after your momentary advantage has been fading and the opponent is about to pull ahead again, and then you just draw that Obliterate and they die instead of stabilizing. So it's just pretty versatile. Then we have 2 Purify as additional removal. I think 2 is probably the right number. There is a possibility, especially at least for ladder, that you might want to run, or could run at least 3. First of all, I wouldn't know what to cut for the third one. Second of all, the deck actually is surprisingly good against aggro already. Just like, it doesn't look that good against aggro with its wonky and fragile early game, but even without the 2 Purify before, the deck has been putting up usually quite positive win rates against fire aggro decks, especially against Skycrag, but also against other fire aggro decks. So it's just not that needed to run more than 2, because the aggro decks are where this is best. And even though it costs 1 less now, the fact that it's a spell and not a fast spell definitely also makes it weaker, so it's not a pure buff. And yeah, the card is just situational, and I don't see how it is, for example, overall better than Initiation, and we already have only 2 Initiation, and Initiation also has synergy with Dawnwalker, while Purify has no synergy with anything. So this is pretty clearly a 2-off for me at the moment. I think people are possibly overrating and overhyping this card too much, but it's a nice role player and adds some more early defense and versatility in dealing with some problems to the deck for sure. Then the Initiation that I already mentioned, this is also basically a 2 or a 3-off, once again due to situationalness and space concerns. I currently opted for 2, but it's a card that I could see considering a 3rd for similar reasons as Purify, but right now 2 is fine. If you feel like you want a 3rd, if you find a cut that satisfies you, why not? But I think the 1 Flame Blast, for example, is probably better than a 3rd Purify or Initiation, for example. And I think I would lean more towards a 3rd Initiation than a 3rd Purify, because Purify really just seems to help mostly in your better matchups already anyway. And yeah, that sums up all the non-power cards. Monument is just one of the big payoffs of being time midrange, because midrange decks are the decks that benefit most from monuments and can most afford to run 4 monuments. Rest of the power base is just heavily skewed towards time, mostly because we need time sigils early on for our initiate. We have 15 turn 1 ready time, just 1 less than I would usually like, but for a deck that doesn't need it that often on turn 1, sometimes just playing it on turn 2 is just as good, so it's not as bad to play it less often on turn 1 than in some other decks, I would argue, given that the deck doesn't have that many and that good 2-drops either. Also, of course, the deck is much heavier time than fire, so I rather have like 2 or 3 time and say 1 fire than the other way around. Also because Amber Acolyte having time means we can play Amber Acolyte, and having 2 time means we can play Temple Scribes, which both help improve our influence from there, and most of our core cards that keep our deck functional and afloat cost at least 2 time, like Dawnwalker, Displacer, and Titan, and Scribe. So time is definitely more important, and monuments are not full time sources either, because past a certain point they turn into units and don't help our time sources anymore. And we also have 2 triple time units and only 1 triple fire card that isn't both at the same time, and Carnosaur is definitely a more important thing to play in a timely manner than Flame Blast. Or Diogo, I actually forgot about... Oh no, Diogo is only a double fire, never mind, I was talking about triple cost. So yeah, and also basically playing more time sigils over fire sigils mainly does one thing. It means we more aggressively diplomatic seal on fire, unless we need the diplomatic seal for our turn 1 initiate. Having flexible power sources like Seeks or seals that don't require another influence like Acolyte basically just means the more you shift your base sigils towards 1 influence, the more your versatile influence givers turn from 50-50 influence givers to, say, 70-30 or whatever. They just become used as the influence that has fewer sigils in the deck more often, without effectively changing the overall feel of your deck in terms of how much fire and time you have access to, except that it increases your total amount of potential turn 1 time sources, for example, for a card like Initiate to virtually 15, which is a big deal because since it's a small time window of one turn and your opening hand only, it's just pure math. You just have to push the probabilities of having that ready time source in your opening hand as much as you can without crippling your deck to make your Initiate of the Sands, for example, as good as possible. And also we have Temple Scribes as well on turn 2, so having more time sigils makes this so much more consistent as a 2-drop, which is important in a deck that has few early game units to begin with, especially other early game units than Temple Scribe, and whose early game is very weak and very much dependent on playing the few early game cards that it has, and being able to consistently play your Temple Scribe on turn 2 is a big deal in a deck like this, especially when you are on the defense. So yeah, that's about it. Basically, keep in mind, if you already have 2 time established, and then you should aggressively seal on fire. Like I usually set up my 3rd fire influence before, like if I have 2 fire and 2 time, and I have a diplomatic seal, I almost always go for diplomatic seal on fire, unless I already have a Carnosaur in hand and no triple fire card. But if you don't, you basically just always want to seal on fire first, because having 3 fire and 2 time is much better than having 3 time and 2 fire, because you obviously, as you can see, have much more outs to draw your 3rd time source than your 3rd fire source. So make sure to secure your 3rd fire source first if you don't need either at the moment, because you're more likely to naturally get the 3rd time than the 3rd fire. That makes sense. Alright, that was a pretty long deck tech. I hope you guys enjoyed going that deep into the deck. One thing that I wanted to say, shout out to kcnabrev or kcnabrev, because he basically is the first one that I saw running a build very similar to this a couple months ago, I think in August, in ETS, and people copied it from there. And the deck is definitely something that I wouldn't have come up with myself in that form, because I just built kind of more rigid and yeah, just with like kind of a bit different philosophy on these things. And the more I basically looked at at his deck and also played it a bit and like thought it through, the more elegant and yeah, well curated it seemed to me. I actually would go as far as saying that I think it's probably the best or one of the best decklists that I've seen in the game that have managed to establish themselves as like the stock build, the go-to version of a given archetype that people just simply copied and played and succeeded with. The deck won like 3 tournaments, top 8'd, put tons of people in top 8, and there were basically only like 1 or 2 things that I disliked about his list. Like he basically had 1 power less, he had 3 monuments and 27 power, and 4 Seek power, in addition to all the power that is here. And I simply don't see how you can run 35 power between like basically 31 power and 4 Acolytes, and also 4 Initiates, so it was like 31 power plus Acolyte plus Initiate in a deck that has like, his initial list had 5 6-drops only, it had 3 Heart and 2 Carnosaur, and also only 3 monuments in the ton of power that he ran, which just seems absurd to me, which is even more surprising that people like copied that list, because normally lists are on the other end of the spectrum. They don't run enough influence, they don't run enough power, they are super greedy and inconsistent, and this deck was like, in my opinion, basically in the other direction. It was running a bit too much color fixing and power and was too conservative in that regard, which is why I dialed it back. I cut the 4 Seeks for 1 monument and basically to make room for the 2 Purifies and I think the 6-drop or something. And deck felt pretty good. Like it might be within 1 power short and might run a little smoother and feel a little better with 1 more power. But all in all, the deck felt and performed pretty well, and it's, I would say, either this power and influence configuration or like 1 more power source. Probably like a Fire Sigil or a Singleton Seek, or even simply another Wisp to make the deck a bit better at hitting its like 6th power drop more frequently and earlier, or something like that. But yeah, he is the first one that I know ran this style of Praxis, and not sure if he was also the one that came up with it or if he got the list from someone or somewhere. But yeah, shout out to him. He gave us the core established functional Praxis Midrange version that has proven itself over and over by now, and all I basically did is take his ideas and concept and build upon it and fix the things that I felt were suboptimal and could be improved upon. But the main credit goes for him for coming up with a lot of like concepts and slots for the thing, like the one of Diogo Flame Blast thing, only running a few Wisps and not running Obelisk and all these things, and only running 3 Displacers, because the card, like I said, is very versatile, but flooding on them due to their situationalness and so on can also be kind of awkward and make you too dirtily and so on. Alright, once again, very long deck tech. Hope you enjoyed all the information and insight that I provided you with. Deck feels really good. The last 20 games that I played, I went like 14-6, and the deck just felt really, really good. And we'll hop into 6 games as usual. So stay tuned for the first half of these 6 games coming up in a moment to see how it does in action. Thanks for watching, guys.